Hello everyone, this is Stjepan. I'll continue the analysis of round 7 of the candidates with a very instructive English opening played between Kramnik and Ding Liren. And Kramnik, I must say, is really mixing it up with his openings this tournament, and in this game he opened with the English c4. Previously he played both e4 and d4 in the last 6 games. Knight f6 by Ding Liren, the most common reply, not going for the Asian court with e6. Knight to c3 by Kramnik, e5, the most aggressive move, striking in the center. Knight to f3, knight to c6, the two knights English, d3, and g6. And this is still all common theory. White is supposed to have a slight edge here, but black has a clear plan of development, and all his pieces stand well. It's not really a fighting opening, and both sides develop before any exchanges occur. We have g3, bishop to g7, bishop to g2, both sides fianchetto their kingside bishops, and here both sides castle. d6 by Ding Liren, and b3. Kramnik goes for a double fianchetto, preparing to target Ding Liren's kingside with bishop to b2 later on, and also solidifying his c4 pawn in the event of black pushing b5 or d5, which is very thematic in the English opening, especially from this position. Knight to d4, also a thematic move by Ding Liren, offering Kramnik to double his pawns, but the pawn on d4, if Kramnik takes, would be very strong, as it would be easily defendable with c5, and it would give enough compensation for the structural defect, so Kramnik doesn't take. Instead he retreats the knight to d2, c6, e3, chasing the knight away, it goes to e6, bishop to b2, fianchettoing his queenside bishop, and knight to c5 in this position, targeting the weak d3 pawn, and Kramnik defends with queen to c2, which perhaps wasn't the most precise move. Perhaps moving the knight to f3 was better. a5 by Ding Liren, not the most precise move once again, but it's preparing to go for a minority attack on the queen side, and definitely strengthening b5, trying to disrupt white's harmonious pawn structure and perhaps even open up the b file potentially. Kramnik reacts with rook a to e1 here, ignoring Ding Liren's intentions, rook to e8, h3, preventing black's pieces from going to g4, but also making extra room for the king in case Ding Liren develops the queen to b6 on the a7 g1 diagonal, and removing the king from that diagonal, because then white could push f4, e4 or f3. Bishop to f5, attacking the weak d3 pawn, and Kramnik makes the lesser evil move. He plays e4. He had to defend by this weakening maneuver, and now black has more than equalized in this position. He stands even a bit better, and Kramnik has weakened the d4 square, and it can now be used as a permanent outpost for Ding Liren's pieces, especially the knight, as moving pawns should always be done considering the squares it's weakening, as sometimes allowing your opponent's piece to enter a central square means defeat, actually. But it's not as weakening here, it's not as critical here, and black is only slightly better. Ding Liren retreats to d7, and Kramnik plays knight to e2, strengthening an eventual f4 pawn advance, which he could play in this position because he needs a pawn break to activate his pieces, and it's also opening up the kingside if he does it, and he's also eyeing the weakened d4 square with his knight, so strengthening it a bit more. And b5 by Ding Liren, striking on the queenside, which wasn't as good in this position. Better would have been to retreat the knight to e6 and to defend d4 some more, as Kramnik is now able to play an important central pawn break, the aggressive d4 himself, equalizing in this position and getting away with weakening the square on e4 by weakening the square d4 by playing e4, as Ding Liren can no longer exploit that easily. And we have e takes d4, knight takes d4, rook to c8, looking at Kramnik's queen on c2, and knight 4 to f3, perhaps preparing to push e5, opening up the center, and Ding Liren plays a great move, d5, a great reaction, because it doesn't allow Kramnik to take control of the position, and it opens up lines for black's pieces, especially the rook on c8, which is lined up with the white's queen. And we have e takes d5 in this position, rook takes e1, exchanging a pair of rooks, and c takes d5. And here Kramnik goes badly wrong. He should have reinforced c4 by playing bishop to f1, or perhaps played the aggressive knight e5. Instead, he took the b-pawn, which makes his position much worse. And Ding now has the initiative, tactical possibilities, and far better piece activity after c takes b5. For now, there aren't useful discoveries on the queen by moving the knight, so Ding Liren gains the tempo with bishop to f5, the queen retreats to d1, which is an awful move, but the position is almost losing for white here anyway, because of c takes b5, and here Ding Liren plays a crushing move, forking the bishop and the rook on e1, knight to d3, and Kramnik has to give up the exchange, because he would otherwise lose an entire piece. He plays bishop to d4, but it's not in fact even giving up the exchange, it's giving up the queen for 2 pieces, and Ding Liren plays the best move here, the brilliant rook to c1, not taking the rook of course, as this way he's threatening to win not the exchange but the whole rook, and Kramnik is just forced to give up the queen for 2 pieces. Any other move loses instantly. So he takes the rook on c1, knight takes c1, rook takes c1, and knight to e4 in this position, and Ding has a queen for 2 pieces, which is not winning, but potentially it's much better for black if he manages to activate his pieces properly. And knight e4 is a great start. It's a super aggressive move by Ding, as he is now entering black's position with all his pieces, but also activating the sleeping bishop on g7. And here he has a definite advantage. It's not easily winning, but it's definitely convertible. And in this position, Kramnik plays his second big blunder of the game. He should have played rook to d1, just reinforcing his pieces, or he could have tried bishop to a7, highlighting the fact that he does have a strong passed b-pawn, which he could push to b6 if the bishop would need defending. But instead he played a weak move, wanting to avoid further exchanges, which is understandable since he is a bit of material down. He plays knight to f1, making his position even more passive than it was and giving Ding far too much time to improve. The best move for black here was bishop to d7, attacking b5. Instead, he played bishop takes d4, which is also okay. And after knight takes d4, queen b6, attacking the knight, and the pawn is defending, the b5 pawn. And Kramnik first captures on e4 with bishop takes. We have d takes, and now knight takes f5, doubling Ding Liren's pawns. And after g takes f5, a4, defending b5. And now they have entered a very interesting and instructional endgame. Materially speaking, it's completely equal. It's knight and rook and 6 pawns versus queen and 5 pawns, so 14 points of material each. But Kramnik has a slight edge even, and the trades that led to this have definitely benefited him greatly, as he has now a great positional asset, which is the protected passed pawn on b5. And he definitely can't lose, which is amazing after having to give up the queen, as rook and knight are almost always able to create a fortress position and protect the pawns and the king, which makes it impossible for the queen to make any progress. And the other fact in white's favor in this endgame is that black has doubled f-pawns, and it's really hard, if not impossible, for him to create a passed pawn of his own on the king side and thus increase pressure on white's position. And Kramnik has definitely saved himself. The game continues with queen to e6, attacking b3, and Kramnik could defend it with rook to c3. It was the best move, but he decides to play a more active move, knight to e3, and after queen takes pawn, he plays rook to c4, defending a4, which he can't afford to lose, of course, and attacking the weak f5 pawn with the knight. But perhaps he shouldn't have gone for this. Defending the pawn would have been more solid, as now once a4 falls, if it does fall, black will have a very strong passed pawn on a5. The game continues with h5. Ding Liren is advancing on the king side, h4, stopping him, king to h7, getting the king closer to play. Of course, not king to g7, because knight takes f5 would be with tempo on the king. And in that position, Aronian would be in time to come back to e3 with the knight, so Ding couldn't take the c4 rook, which knight is defending. King to g2, f6, rook d4, wasting the tempo, and king to g6, defending f5. And perhaps black has a slight edge now, but definitely not enough to win. But still it remains the fact that Kramnik shouldn't have given up the b-pawn. But he did manage to create an impregnable fortress, and it's not clear how Ding Liren should attack or make any progress. Rook to c4, just repeating moves, king to f7, king h2, king g6, king g1, just repeating, as he has no useful moves to improve his position. Queen to b1 check, king g2, queen b3, rook to d4, king f7, and in this position Kramnik makes his worst blunder of the game. Instead of keeping the position solid, as there is absolutely no way for black to threaten him, his king or any of his pieces or pawns, He makes a horrible decision, completely underestimating Ding's possibilities, and he decides to offer a trade of pawns by playing rook to d5, giving away a4 in exchange for f5, which is a double pawn anyway, and the position now went from completely equal to completely losing for white. But it's hard to understand why, and it's hard for black to convert, but still he is now given a chance to make progress finally. He takes on a4, we have rook takes f5, king g6 threatening the rook and defending h5, b6, queen to b3, Ding offers the a pawn for the a pawn for the b pawn, and we get an exchange. Rook takes a5, queen takes b6, and the material is still equal, but black has now been allowed to take control, and Kramnik is no longer able to defend with the fortress. And what's worse, he made Ding's pawns mobile and gave him a clear plan of attack now, because undoubling the f pawns now gave black a possibility to create a passed pawn of his own, or at least to break through to white's position and to white's king, and to be able to check with the queen. So the position is definitely not as safe as it used to be. So Kramnik would have definitely done better just keeping it as it was and keeping it closed up in a fortress. The game continues with rook to d5, queen b2, rook to f5. Now they play a lot of moves which are maneuvering, and Ding Liren is trying to penetrate, but he will have to risk it to achieve something. Queen a2, rook to c5, and Kramnik is now repeating moves, and he would, I'm sure, agree to a draw, but still he decided to risk it with rook to d4, which I still don't understand why. Queen to e2, rook to c4, queen a2, rook b4, queen a5, rook b8, queen a2, and Ding doesn't find a way to break through, even though he is a lot better here. He should have perhaps tried f5 at the right moment, as the queen is able to cause a lot of trouble once the position opens up. We have rook to d8, queen a5, rook d5, a bunch of repeating, queen a2, rook f5, queen e6, rook d5, queen a6, and here Kramnik goes for a win, even though he is worse. He pushes g4, and I'm sure he wanted to win, because if he had wanted a draw now, he could have just repeated. H takes g, h5 check, and of course Ding shouldn't accept the sacrifice if the rook moves even. He should just run away with the king. He goes to f7, rook d7 check, king e6, rook to g7, threatening g4, and Ding stands much better here, even though Kramnik is trying to make his h-pawn dangerous. He plays queen to e2, and Kramnik could have taken the g4 pawn in this position, but he decided not to. He pushed h6 instead, as passed pawns become much more dangerous as they approach the queening rank. Queen f3 check, king g1, and g3 in this position, now trying to open up the position, but sacrificing a pawn in the process. Rook takes g3, queen to h5, threatening h6, rook g7, f5, h7, f4, starting to push white back and not fearing the advanced h-pawn. We have knight to g4, queen to h3, rook g6 check, king f5, rook g7, king e6, and here, instead of king e6, Ding could have played e3, which would lead to a drawn queen versus rook and knight ending, but he decided to play king e6. Rook to g6 check, king f5, and now knight to h6 check, blocking the queen's defense of h1 and forcing queening, and in reality forcing a drawn endgame, because now Ding Liren has to take the rook is undefended, so king takes g6, white queens, and now queen takes knight, and this is now just a drawn queen versus queen endgame, and after queen to e8, king f5, queen b5 check, king g4, queen e2, king f5, and queen to b5 check, they agreed to a draw. It's completely drawn, even though black is a pawn up. There is nothing he can do, because both sides have a perpetual check if they want. Unfortunate for Ding, as he stood much better after winning the queen for rook and knight, which is better if there is pieces on the board, but entering this endgame with once the rest of the pieces got off is almost always a draw. And this is now Ding Liren's 7th draw in a row, unbelievably, and he might be called Anish Giri after the tournament, the way he is playing. And Kramnik is also a 3.5 out of 7 after 7 rounds. And they are sharing third place and trailing behind Fabiano Caruana, who is in clear first with an amazing score of 5 out of 7. So they will both definitely have to up their game if they wish to be in the running for first place. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you got something from this instructional endgame. See you soon with more games from the candidates, and bye. Cheers!